This is an open message to the Apostate Prophet. Earlier this month, AP and I announced that we would be having a debate about God, atheism, and morality as soon as we reach two channel milestones, 100 million views on my channel and 200,000 subscribers on AP's channel. We are about to reach those channel milestones. I'm over 99 million views and he's over 199,000 subs. So it's time to transition to debate mode. I haven't heard AP say a lot about his views, but during one of our live streams, I believe I heard him say that morality consists of the rules that we come up with to reach a certain goal. So if our goal is human well-being or human flourishing, we can figure out rules for reaching our goal, and those rules are morality. There are multiple problems with this position that AP might want to fix before he presents his case. In other words, if he presents his opening statement and doesn't fix the problems, I'm going to have a pretty easy first rebuttal. But if he modifies his position so that it doesn't have the problems, I'll have to look for other problems. I could have said this to AP in private, but his view is a popular view among atheists. I think Sam Harris is the one who popularized one version of this approach. Lots of atheists are convinced that it's a good account of morality. So I want to draw attention to the problems ahead of time in case there's a stronger atheist case for morality. And I'm sharing this in public so that if any of my viewers can think of a way to fix the atheist position, you can share it in the comments section. AP's position, assuming I heard him correctly, is remarkably similar, if not identical, to the position that Matt Dillahunty presented in his opening statement in our recent debate. It only took me a few seconds to spot some problems, and I think I can come up with a few more. Dillahunty responded to my objections. However, Dillahunty's response is not available to the Apostate Prophet, because the Apostate Prophet has some other differences from Dillahunty, which make Dillahunty's response off limits to the Apostate Prophet. So in this video, we're going to take a look at a few obvious problems with a popular atheist account of morality. Then we'll see how Matt Dillahunty responded to these problems. And finally, I'll explain why the Apostate Prophet can't use Dillahunty's response. I will then wash my hands of the matter, and we'll have to wait and see what AP comes up with. In my debates with Matt Dillahunty, I spoke first, then Dillahunty gave his opening statement. In his opening statement, he laid out his foundation for morality. In short, human beings seek well-being. There's no objective moral obligation for us to seek well-being. There's no requirement that we seek well-being, we just seek well-being. But because we have a goal, human well-being, there are better and worse ways of working towards that goal. Here are some clips.
But my position is that as far as I can tell, there are no objective moral, no requirement that one care about well-being or human suffering or human flourishing or any of that. There's nothing about the universe that requires that we care about that. And yet, we do. This is what we've always talked about when it comes to morality. We are talking about how do humans interact? What are the consequences of our actions? Do those consequences make life better or worse for human beings? There's no requirement that one care about that, but if two people do care about that, then they can begin to assess what sort of actions one should do to achieve the goal of a better life for human beings. But the objections that I always seem to get are, yes, but why do you care about well-being in the first place? And we're not just saying that it's objectively, or that it is some truth that, oh, we care about it because we care about it, and that makes it true in the sense of an objective imperative. We're saying it is true that we care about this. I'm assuming that you care about it too. I'm assuming you'd like to live a better life. I'm assuming you care about how we evaluate interactions between human beings and what would be an action that benefits oneself or others or society, etc. And that because as long as we have to share space, we should work together to find the things that make life better for all of those people who care about making life better. Now, the immediate concern is, well, okay, well, what if I don't care about making life better? Cool, then I'm not talking to you. And I don't know where the word objective came from, because the word objective doesn't appear in the debate title, nor am I here saying in any way that there are objective, intrinsic moral values or truths in anywhere.
Notice, Dillahunty repeatedly denies that there's any sort of moral obligation to seek human well-being or human flourishing. There's no requirement that we seek well-being. We just do, and because we do, we can discover, by experience, better and worse ways of working towards that goal. If you don't seek that goal, he's not talking to you.
There are no objective moral, no requirement that one care about well-being or human suffering or human flourishing or any of that. There's nothing about the universe that requires that we care about that. The immediate concern is, well, okay, well, what if I don't care about making life better? Cool, then I'm not talking to you.
Dillahunty offers an analogy to help us understand his position.
This is why I use the chess game as an example. Chess is entirely arbitrary. The rules are subjective. We invented it, we came up with the board, the pieces, how they move, how they interact. But once we sit down at the chess game and we decide that we would rather not lose, it doesn't matter if you are the opposition or a teammate or a coach. If we can agree that the goal is to not lose the game, then we can agree non-subjectively about which moves are better and which moves are worse.
So, if two people sit down and decide that they're making a game called chess, and they agree that the goal is to win, and they agree on the rules, they can discover that certain moves are better than others. Now, as I said during the debate, I happen to agree with what Dillahunty says here. I don't agree that he's found a foundation for morality, but I agree that, given certain goals, there are things we can do to reach those goals. And I think that this is about the best case an atheist can make for any sort of moral system. The problem is, Dillahunty is about 1,000,000 miles away from presenting anything remotely resembling a foundation for morality. And it took me all of 5 seconds to see several problems. One, if you're claiming that although we have no moral obligation or requirement to seek the well-being of humanity, it's just something we do, well, there are all kinds of things that we just do. In the 20th century, human beings gladly killed millions of other human beings. The Stanley Milgram experiment and its follow-ups around the world showed that most human beings are completely willing to torture and possibly kill their fellow human beings for little or no reason. So if you're basing your moral system on the claim that human beings just happen to seek the well-being of humanity, I think we're in trouble. Two, if morality is simply the means to an end, the strategies for reaching a goal, a person could modify the goal, in which case there would be different strategies for reaching it, and these strategies would be morality. So if a person says, my goal isn't the well-being of all humanity, my goal is the establishment of a pure Aryan race, the means of reaching that goal might include slaughtering all non-white people, and that would be morality for him. The obvious problem is that's not what we mean by morality. Three, and this is the one I focused on most. Recall, Dillahunty said that there's no requirement, no objective moral obligation to seek human well-being or human flourishing. Moral obligations only come into play once you've agreed to the goal. Well, if moral obligations only come into play once you've agreed to the goal, it stands to reason that if you don't agree to the goal, you have no moral obligations. So, in my rebuttal, I pointed out that Dillahunty's view is precisely the view I had of morality when I bashed my dad's head in with a hammer when I was 18 years old. As an atheist teenager, I concluded that moral obligations are completely conditional. They only apply if you agree to them. They're voluntary. If you agree to go along with other human beings and work towards some goal, then yes, you'll have some sort of moral system. But if you don't agree, if you just don't care, if you think that it's a hilarious joke that these lumps of cells crawling all over a speck of debris in the universe are convinced that anything they do matters, you have no moral obligation to do anything. Hence, if you don't care about human well-being and you bash a man's head in, you haven't violated any moral obligation. You haven't done anything immoral. That's not morality. When we talk about morality, We're often talking about objective moral obligations. We want to say, 18-year-old David, you have a moral obligation not to bash people's skulls in, regardless of what you think or believe. So if you bash your dad's head in, you've violated a moral obligation. The system of morality that Dillahunty lays out in his opening statement can't provide any basis for such a moral obligation. Therefore, he's totally missed the mark on what we mean by morality. As a rule, if your theory of morality entails that I did nothing wrong when I bashed my dad's head in with a ball-peen hammer, you need a new theory of morality. Now, how does Dillahunty deal with these objections? He deals with my objections by contradicting what he said in his opening statement. Dillahunty throws himself under the bus. In his rebuttal, he admits again that there's no objective moral obligation.
There's no reason to think that there's some objective moral imperative out there. What we're talking about is surviving, thriving, and recognizing that as beings in this universe, there are things that we can do that make our lives better and make our lives worse.
But when we get to the discussion, we suddenly find out that whether you agree with the goal of seeking human well-being or not, you're somehow still obligated to seek it. You have moral obligations whether you think you do or not, and we're part of a society that will impose moral obligations on you whether you agree with the goals of society or not. Side note, a moral obligation that's independent of your feelings and beliefs would be, by definition, an objective moral obligation. It's natural from atheism to think that these moral obligations that we think are real, that you shouldn't do that, are just delusional, right? And I think you agree with that, right? If I think I have a moral obligation not to hit someone, your position is, if I decide that I'm seeking the well-being of humanity or of other people or something like that, then there are right ways and wrong ways to go about that. And so there are some rules. But as I pointed out, if I don't sign on to that, if I say I'm not seeking the well-being of humanity, then there is no moral obligation.
The moral
There's
obligation
no moral obligation outside of that.
So whether or not you think you have a moral obligation, you are part of a society that will impose a moral obligation on you.
Now notice, but according to your theory, I had no moral obligation.
No,
but
I didn't say you don't have one. I said whether or not you think you do.
Wow, wow, wow. Remember way back a few minutes ago when Dillahunty said that there's no requirement to seek human well-being?
There are no objective moral, no requirement that one care about well-being or human suffering or human flourishing or any of that. There's nothing about the universe that requires that we care about that.
Suddenly, as soon as I point out the obvious and indisputable implications of this claim, a requirement to seek human well-being magically appears. Dillahunty continues to admit that there are no objective moral obligations. Moral obligations are all conditional. They only apply if you're seeking some goal. If you don't agree with the goal, where does the moral obligation come in? It just does anyway, because you're playing the game of life. So, Dillahunty's position becomes moral obligations are conditional, but they're not conditional on whether you agree with a goal. They're conditional on whether you're alive and thus playing the game of life.
I don't even understand how this is controversial.
That's not the part I'm regarding as controversial. I'm regarding it as you said. There's nothing in just in the universe that tells us that we have to seek the well-being of humanity and so on. Then you said, but we just do. Most of us just do.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm agreeing with all that. I'm agreeing with that part. I'm agreeing with you saying, so once you decide, hey, here's what I'm seeking, then you can, just like if you said, hey, here are the rules of chess, and here's what winning is, and there are moves that are going to be better for that. You can figure that out, and it's not simply subjective. Some moves are better than others. I agree with that completely. But you're saying that it is all our moral obligations are in that sense conditional.
Yes.
You have agreed to do this. If our
not conditional on your agreement to do it, conditional on the fact that you are playing a game with these rules. We're playing life whether we decided to or not.
So, opening statement. If some people can agree on a goal, then they can come up with some rules and strategies for aiming towards the goal. Discussion period. It doesn't matter whether you agree on the goal, you're alive, and thus you have to follow the rules of the game of life. Dillahunty eventually tries to give some account of why a person who doesn't care about human well-being would nevertheless be obligated to play by the rules.
And for somebody to sit around and say, I don't care, I'm not going to be here. Okay, they're not participating in the system, but they're benefiting from it now. And the obligation, I would say, that any of us have is because we've already benefited from the work that others have done. It doesn't mean I'm required, I don't have to. You can't make me pay it back. I can, in a way I could, but you're right that I can't force you to have a motivation to pay back what you've already benefited from. And yet, if you don't, we can look at you and say, you are not a moral person. And when we say that, we're not saying you are not living up to an imperative, a universal objective imperative. We are saying you are not living up to how we have defined morality to be.
So, you've benefited from society, and you're therefore indebted to society. So you have a moral obligation to pay society back. Is it objective? It can't be objective because objective moral obligations don't exist. It's obviously conditional. If you seek human well-being, here's what you need to do to get it. But the question was, what happens if someone doesn't care about human well-being? And Dillahunty's response is that you have moral obligations anyway because you've benefited from society. Are you understanding this yet? Dillahunty goes on to claim that even if you don't care about human well-being, moral obligations arise simply from the circumstances. It sounds like what your position is now. When you were giving your opening statement, it sounded like you were saying, yes, there's nothing in this world that would compel you to, a person who didn't want to actually seek the good of humanity, but once you've agreed that you are seeking well-being, then there are certain ways to get there.
No. Once you've agreed, now we can have the conversation about what is better.
Yeah, that's fine.
But you are under whatever obligations you're under from the circumstances anyway.
Then he claims, one, that human beings impose moral obligations, and two, that the universe imposes moral obligations. But he says this in response to a question about why a person who doesn't share the goal of human well-being has moral obligations. I'm trying to locate the moral obligation for someone who says, I just don't care about those things, or I care about something.
We impose a moral obligation.
No, that's what I mean. You're saying society imposes a moral obligation.
The physical facts of the universe imposes a moral obligation.
You just said that the universe doesn't impose. You said there's nothing in the universe that imposes the moral obligation.
The physical facts of the universe dictate what is better. And if we're going to talk about morality and define morality as seeking what is better, that's where the
physical facts of the universe dictate what is better.
For us, yes.
Remember, Dillahunty already declared that the universe can't impose any obligation or requirement to pursue human well-being. Now, when I'm asking why a person who doesn't pursue human well-being nevertheless has the moral obligation to pursue human well-being, it's the universe that imposes it. So I ask again for clarification on where this moral obligation comes in, and Dillahunty gets sick of giving answers that completely contradict his earlier statements, and he tells me to solve it with God. Yeah, I'd like to pursue that. I still don't get where the moral obligation is coming in for someone who, if you have a conditional statement, if X, then Y. If you're seeking well-being, then here's how you get to it.
Solve it with God. What is my moral obligation with your God model?
Then we have a little disagreement because he claims that he's offered a foundation for morality, and all he's offered are a series of contradictory claims. The entire time I was asking myself, if I were still an 18-year-old atheist who didn't care about human well-being at all and who instead found human beings pretty disgusting, what has he said that would have given me any indication that I was under any moral obligation whatsoever? I couldn't think of anything, and I therefore concluded no foundation.
I'm talking about secular humanism. The subject of this debate is secular humanism a better foundation than...
It's no foundation.
It is absolutely a foundation.
There's no foundation.
Okay.
Shockingly, Dillahunty goes on to admit that we seek our own well-being simply because we're human beings, and that what seems like an objective obligation to seek our own well-being is just some sort of delusion.
That we should rely on data, evidence, reason, and that human life has value to us because we're human. That's the part of the reality that carries with it this seeming objective motivation, and the fact that it seems that way doesn't mean it is.
So there's no real objective.
No.
There's no objective.
Not real in the sense that you're talking about, where there's some universal imperative.
People who believe that when they're saying you have an objective moral obligation not to bash someone's head in or not to shoot a man in Reno, they're kind of delusional.
Only objective with respect to the goal.
The moral obligation not to bash a man's head in is only objective with respect to a goal. Again, what if I don't share that goal? Well, you have the moral obligation anyway, even without the goal. Remember, you're playing the game of life. That somehow solves the problem. If a person has a moral sense and believes that certain things are wrong, according to certain worldviews, they would regard that as some sort of delusion, that it doesn't correspond to reality. Yes, it might help my species, yes, it might this, but it's not an objective moral wrong. It's something different entirely. You've agreed with that. You've said, yes, there is no moral obligation. There's no moral obligation there. The only sorts of things you could call obligations are once you've agreed to seek a certain goal, there are things that can help you get there and so on. Again, that is very different from what people...
I've said that 3 times now, I think, probably. It's not that you agreed. You're playing the game, no matter what. You might not think you have any moral obligation, but go ahead.
2 interesting questions came up during the Q&A. Jay Shai pointed out that if we have a moral obligation to seek human well-being, that would be a categorical imperative. I was trying to avoid philosophical terminology during the debate. I couldn't get around using the word objective, but a hypothetical imperative is something like, if you want to become a tennis champion, then get a good coach and practice a lot. If you want this, then do that. A categorical imperative is do this. There's no if-then. Now, Dillahunty believes in a lot of hypothetical imperatives. If you seek human well-being, then do X, Y, and Z. But for that initial imperative, seek human well-being, what kind of imperative is that? Interestingly, Dillahunty says it's not a categorical imperative. There are only hypotheticals.
Jay Shai, thanks for your question. They asked, why ought we increase well-being? Why is that good? And then they said, there is a categorical imperative. I think they're maybe saying, like, does this fit with a categorical?
No, I think he's saying that is that's not a, I think he's saying, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but if he's saying seek well-being, you got a couple of positions. I think Matt's position is we just do it. We just by nature, we do it. But I think he's saying that a conditional imperative or a hypothetical imperative is if you want this, then this is the way to get it. Whereas a categorical imperative is do this, right? It's not if you want this. So I think he's saying if we say we have to seek well-being, whether we care about it or not, or whether we want to or not, we just have to do it, then that's more of a categorical imperative. And I think he's saying, how would you reconcile that with your view? So I think that's what he means.
I see.
And my view is that there's not a categorical imperative.
Gotcha. Thanks so much.
It is conditional.
So, seek the well-being of humanity is not a categorical imperative. Neither is it a hypothetical imperative. It's not, if you seek this other goal, then seek the well-being of humanity. Hence, there's no imperative at all. And yet, we all have to obey this non-imperative. We have to obey a command that's somehow not a command. And if we don't, society will force us to. This raises a further question, namely whether the majority decides these kinds of issues. If there's no imperative, hypothetical or categorical, to seek the good of humanity, then I'm not disobeying a command or violating a moral obligation if I refuse to seek the good of humanity. And yet, Dillahunty has said that society will impose moral obligations on me anyway. Does this mean that the majority gets to decide what's right? Cosmic Skeptic asks this question.
Got a question from Cosmic Skeptic. Alex is asking Matt, he says, is Matt saying that the majority view makes for moral truth? Is ethical truth a democracy?
No.
Are not exceptions, in fact, quote, counterexamples?
No, because the majority can in fact be wrong. It is the goal of getting better. We've discovered where we've been wrong before, and we've been monumentally wrong, a lot of us. What the current model is for society at any given moment in time does not mean that that is right. It just means that that is the best representation of our understanding at that moment in time.
So the majority doesn't decide what's right, and yet they get to impose moral obligations on me even though I'm under no imperative whatsoever. In this case, might makes right. The universe imposes no moral obligation on me to seek human well-being, and yet it does anyway. There's no requirement to seek human well-being, and yet there is. If you don't care about human well-being, Dillahunty has nothing to say to you. You're not part of the discussion. And yet, Dillahunty has a lot to say to you, and you will be forced to join the discussion. Your belief that we have an objective moral obligation to pursue human well-being is delusional, and yet you absolutely must pursue human well-being even after recognizing that your belief is delusional. Guys, I'm trying really, really hard to understand this position. I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt. I believe that somewhere hidden in this mess is the best that atheists can come up with to justify morality, but all I see is a bunch of contradiction, fallacy, and delusion. Contradiction because it's a bunch of, there's no requirement, but there is, even though there isn't. You have to seek the good of humanity, which is a categorical imperative, but there are no categorical imperatives. Moral obligation only enters the picture when people agree on a certain goal, even though you still have the moral obligation when you completely reject the goal. The majority doesn't decide what's right, even though if you don't side with the majority is going to force you to side with them. And it's right.
A foundation has to be stable.
Fallacy, because the entire debate was one massive example of the is-ought fallacy. Many human beings, in fact, seek their own well-being, therefore we ought to seek human well-being. Dillahunty insists that he's not claiming that there's a moral obligation or an imperative telling us to seek human well-being, and yet he clearly is.
A foundation has to be stable.
Delusion, because even if human beings seek well-being, they also seek all kinds of other things: money, control, power, fame, unbridled pleasure, superiority. These goals can sometimes conflict with one another. And since morality is simply the rules and strategies for pursuing a goal, you can make morality pretty much anything you want.
A foundation has to be stable.
This can't be the foundation of morality. So that's all I really see here. How is this, as it stands, such a popular ethical position among atheists? I have no idea. But if you can make sense of it, please do so in the comments section. Keep in mind, there are other people out there, like me, people who were born without the normal feelings that keep the rest of you from rebelling against the herd. Because we don't have the feelings that the rest of you rely on, we need a reason to follow the rules. If you can give us a reason, even a reason that has nothing to do with God, I'd love to see it. If you can't give us a reason, I strongly suspect that your morality is grounded in nothing but feelings. But as I said in my opening statement of my debate with Dillahunty, what I find is that atheists simply don't apply the same level of skepticism to their own claims that they apply to the claims of theists. If your moral theory entails that it wasn't wrong of me to bash my dad's head in, I regard your moral theory as completely useless, and repeatedly contradicting yourself and undermining your own theory isn't going to help. This brings us to the Apostate Prophet. Why is Dillahunty's response to my objections not available to the Apostate Prophet? Well, if I didn't know better, which I don't, I might think that Dillahunty presented a position that he really believes in but had never seriously scrutinized. I offered a few simple objections that he would have thought of if he had spent 10 seconds being skeptical about his own view. In order to block these objections, he made up new rules that contradict his original position. The Apostate Prophet is not like that. I don't think he's going to lay down his theory, then pull a bunch of magical moral obligations that somehow aren't moral obligations out of his hat, then get angry and start shouting me down. He's better than that. And his fans, let's face it, are much better than Dillahunty's fans, who seem to love the endless contradictions and made-up rules. They are reveling in irrationality. It's very, very odd to say, here's my foundation for morality, and it's one big mass of contradiction, fallacy, and delusion, and then turn around and call yourself a skeptic when you clearly aren't. There are different kinds of atheists. Some atheists are driven primarily by anger against religion. They claim that they're just going where the evidence points. But when you look closer, it's clear that they're so enraged at Christianity or God that reason and skepticism are mere masks to cover up what's really going on. That's Dillahunty and his fans. If you don't believe me, just watch their comments on this video. They don't care if their hero contradicts himself. They just don't care. And this only proves what I said in my opening statement. If your skeptometer is set so low that you don't even spot contradictions at the foundation of your beliefs, you're not skeptics. There are other atheists who aren't driven by anger. They don't have any noticeable hostility towards God or religious believers. They might believe that certain religious teachings are dangerous, but that doesn't keep them from being careful in their reasoning. Those kinds of atheists can still be skeptical of their own claims. They can look at the mess that Dillahunty presented and say, no, this is nonsense. We need something better than this. The Apostate Prophet is one of those atheists. So, AP, we'll be posting our opening statements soon. If you can figure out a way on atheism to avoid making all of morality voluntary, your position will be much stronger from the beginning. The two basic options ahead are, one, to make all morality conditional on pursuing a certain goal. You can do that. And when I respond, well, according to your moral theory, I did nothing wrong when I bashed my dad's head in, you can bite the bullet and reply, true, you didn't violate any moral obligation, but we're still going to stop you. I see some problems with that, but I don't see any contradiction. Two, you can defend some moral obligation to seek human well-being or human flourishing. If you can defend just one objective moral obligation, much of the rest of your view will fall into place, and it won't be hovering in midair or be grounded in what humans just do. Those are my thoughts on the upcoming debates. I can actually think of a few more objections to the voluntary morality of many modern atheists. I'd be happy to share a video outline of those before the debate in case AP wants to preempt my objections. Whatever else happens, I can almost guarantee that you're going to see a rage-free debate. That's how AP and I and our epic mix of Christian and atheist and Jewish and Hindu fans roll. Don't be a Dillahunty. By the way, What Do You Meme just posted some of his thoughts on Dillahunty's approach. Click the video and check it out, unless you're a racist against black apologists.